let's continue on the topic of record sharing and what happens when we're accessing the database within Apex. So there are these two contexts that are available when we're executing Apex code, and like I said, when we're interacting with the database. So the first one is this system context. And the idea behind this is that it's associated with the keyword without sharing, and it ignores our sharing model. So when you are executing code within a class, and that code is interacting with the database, it is going to find records regardless of whether or not that user can see those within the context of our sharing model. All right? There's user context, and user context is indicated with the keyword with sharing. And what this does is it says, when you're accessing the database, take into account which records this user has and only return those records. Okay? So if you take a look here, so here we have some code. And it's a class where with sharing is applied. And so let me map out this scenario. A user has access to 50 out of the 110 account records. All right? So they can see 50 but not 60. This is going to do a very simple database query. Select count from account, and select count just returns the number of records that it finds. So if I'm going to execute the with sharing class, execute this query within the context of with sharing class, when I do my print out the count here, what is the count? $50, exactly. If we apply without sharing, it will be 110, okay? So what we do is when we apply with sharing or without sharing, it's should you ignore record level access or should you respect record level access when you interact with the database? Make sense? You have the choice. Now, important thing to understand about Apex is that object CRUD and field level security are always ignored. So if I'm executing Apex code, it does not take into account whether or not the user has the proper object CRUD or field level security. So the key thing to understand here is that you have the power to do more than that user is capable of doing within the browser-based tool, or for that matter, within API calls. All right? Now, if you think about your bank and think about your checking account balance, so somewhere in your bank IT system is a checking account balance field. And if you think about your ability, do you have the ability to read that field for your checking account? Yeah. Do you have the ability to write to that field? No, definitely not. Okay. But somewhere is some code running that gives you the ability to increase that by, for instance, let's say depositing a check. So you deposit the check, it executes the code. Same thing goes for if you want to decrease it, you can go to the ATM, do a withdrawal, or write a check, whatever the case may be. So your code has the ability to go beyond what is capable if the user was using the default user interface. Okay? With respect to object CRUD and field level security, you can also programmatically check to see does this user have access to them beforehand. So if you wanted to, you could write your own logic to check to see is this user actually capable of what are they capable of. Okay, so dynamically check that. With sharing and without sharing. Without sharing ignores the sharing model. With sharing respects the sharing model. Let's say that I just declare public class see all data class or whatever. Okay, so let's say I leave off with sharing or without sharing, or for that matter, I'm doing an execute anonymous and there is no declaration of with or without sharing. Okay, so if it's running inside of a trigger, it runs in without sharing, in other words, the system context, and you cannot, these keywords are only applied to class declarations. So it's always going to run in without sharing. If you want your trigger to run in with sharing mode, declare a class and then call the method in the class and mark the class declaration with sharing. So if a trigger is either executing code within the trigger or calling a class that doesn't have the keyword, we run in system context. If it's a custom web service, it runs in system context. If it is a test, that also runs in system context, although I will show you later on when we write our test code, there's a special method called system.runAs, in which case you can create code to emulate whether or not the user has the ability to do it or not. Visual force controllers, it kind of depends on whether you're doing a custom controller or using one of our standard controllers. Standard controllers run in user context and respect the sharing model. Custom controllers do not. Controller extensions, same thing, whether or not they're standard or custom. And then anonymous block, an anonymous block always executes in user context, and so it always respects whether or not you have access to those records. The thing I don't like about the term system context is there's no such thing as a system user in Salesforce. You're never going to see last modified by system, okay? If you think about when we're executing code, if I'm going to do an execute anonymous, I must first present some credentials. When we were doing it through the Force.com IDE, we had to enter in our credentials into the project. If I'm doing it through the developer console, I first had to log in through the web browser. If you're doing a web service call, first thing you got to do is do a login or utilize our OAuth login in order to gain a session, and now you have you are logged in as a user. So even though we call this system context, there's no such thing as a system user. It's whether or not you're operating with system permissions or whether you're operating with your own user permissions with respect to the sharing model. Okay? But that last modified by field is always going to be you in the database, whatever you do to that system. All right? So, quiz questions. By default, all classes are blank and must be marked with virtual in order to be extended. Final, very good. What is the difference between the global and the public access modifier keywords? Let me phrase it this way. What are the 5 use cases for global? Create an AppExchange app, and you want your customers to be able to access your code directly. Batch Apex. Very good. Web service, very good. Custom web service, whether it's SOAP or REST. There's another service.
Scheduled services.
Okay, not what I was going for, but scheduled Apex. And then email services. All right, good job. Okay. So what does the with or without sharing keywords, what do they affect? What do they apply to? Let me put it to that way. Apex execution, and then what is your Apex doing? Yeah, accessing the database. So whether or not the user has the ability to find the record based on a query or update the record based on a DML operation that they might perform. Okay. When are static variables garbage collected? The end of the transaction. So at the end of the transaction, we do an automatic garbage collection at the very end and clean it up. Okay. And then what is the purpose of the limits method? Governor limits, to find out about the current context of your usage of those resources.